Just over this hill is Bibby Stockholm.
Built in Amsterdam in 1976, Bibby Stockholm is an engineless accommodation barge, which has led a pretty storied life. It's housed homeless people in Hamburg, construction workers in the North Sea, and was briefly under consideration to be used as the world's most depressing block of student flats in Galway. On the 5th of April 2023, however, the UK government announced it had commandeered the vessel and planned to use it as accommodation for around 500 asylum seekers. That is to say, people who have arrived in the UK seeking humanitarian protection, yet who are still awaiting a decision on whether or not they will be awarded formal refugee status.
This unusual approach to housing, well, anyone, has understandably proven deeply controversial. The UK Home Office, which oversees immigration and border security in Britain, has suggested that the use of such vessels is part of a push to, quote, deliver a more orderly, cost-effective and sustainable asylum accommodation system.
Human rights groups, however, have been outraged, and justifiably so. In the few short months since Bibby Stockholm arrived at its new home in Dorset, it's been evacuated due to a disease scare, labelled a potential death trap by firefighters, and compared by one resident to Alcatraz. Despite this pushback, the UK government under Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak remains determined to see this project through, with plans to acquire at least 2 more barges for the same purpose. Sustained fearmongering on the part of the government about invasions of refugees and the glee it appears to be taking in devising such cruel and unusual deterrents echoed not only the anti-migrant rhetoric of Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis in the US, but also the most devastating cultural portrayals of Britain's homegrown political culture, of V for Vendetta, or Years and Years, or Children of Men. The logistics of Bibby Stockholm, the conditions on board, and the grim anti-migrant rhetoric which surrounds it provides a devastating insight, not only into the state of British politics, but into the increasing brazenness with which right-wing politicians the world over are using violence against the vulnerable and voiceless to win votes.
This is the story of Britain's new prison ships. So, from an international perspective, the use of barges to house asylum seekers isn't entirely new.
In fact, Bibby Stockholm itself has previously been used as a detention centre for asylum seekers in Rotterdam, with predictably horrifying consequences.
Nevertheless, the government holding people perceived to be undesirable on boats has a further dark precedent in the UK.
From the 17th to 19th centuries, one of the punishments available to British judges on sentencing someone who had been found guilty of a crime was transportation. This involved convicts being wrestled onto ships and sent as indentured servants, later and more famously to Australia, but initially to Britain's colonies in the Americas. All of which was horrifying in and of itself. But in 1776, events conspired to further add to Britain's prison boat-related cultural trauma. See, in July of that year, the country's 13 colonies in North America declared independence, taking with them the UK's primary penal colonies. And, with nowhere to send people who'd been sentenced to transportation, Britain's domestic jails began to fill up. The government's response was to pass the so-called Hulks Act, permitting the use of decommissioned naval ships, cargo ships, and captured privateer vessels as overflow facilities. From 1776 to 1857, Britain's coastline and rivers were dotted with cramped, decaying vessels, which quickly became notorious for their poor conditions. Dark, dirty, and disease-ridden, one phrase crops up time and again in the scholarship on Britain's first experiment with prison ships: hell on water.
Now, it's important to stress that the people who are due to be housed on Bibby Stockholm are not criminals.
While some would argue that no one should be subjected to such inhumane, dangerous conditions, these are asylum seekers, many of whom are seeking refuge from persecution and war. They find themselves in the care of the state, not because they've had their freedom taken away from them by a judge and jury, but because they've arrived in the UK with nothing.
Given that its residents will not technically be detained, the Home Office has repeatedly denied claims that Bibby Stockholm is a prison at all. Official documents explicitly describe the vessel as, quote, non-detained accommodation, which feels like one of those things where, if you have to clarify...
In fact, if we take a little look at the logistics of how Bibby Stockholm is intended to operate, even the government's most basic claim that asylum seekers housed on the barge will be free to come and go as they want seems pretty questionable. For one, people relocated to Bibby Stockholm will have no choice in that decision. The government has explicitly threatened anyone who is asked to move and refuses to do so with homelessness and a complete cut of all support. After they've moved in, residents are free to enter and leave the vessel itself. Nevertheless, each departure and return requires them to undergo intense airport-style security checks with body scanners and bag searches. Even once they've reached dry ground, residents' freedom extends only to what the port's operators describe as a secure compound surrounding the vessel, enclosed by a 4-metre-high fence and guarded by ex-military personnel. Should they wish to leave the compound entirely, they're forced to wait for a shuttle bus, which will take them from Portland, where the barge is currently moored, to the seaside town of Weymouth, 20 minutes away.
Of course, there are perfectly good, compassionate explanations for each of these measures.
Portland Port is a working dock, and having 500 people wandering freely around has the potential to be highly dangerous, not only for workers, but for the barge's residents themselves. Nevertheless, it's hard to escape the conclusion that this is less a reason to implement security measures than it is to not house people on a barge in the first place.
If highly securitized compounds, fences, and guards don't sound bad enough, on board, things are more oppressive still.
See, Bibby Stockholm was designed to hold 222 people, one in each of its 222 rooms. Even under these conditions, it was reportedly a pretty rough place to live. One former resident, who lived on the barge whilst working at the Shetland gas plant, said that the narrow corridors and low ceilings were enough to send residents stir-crazy, even when staying there voluntarily. The Home Office, however, plans not just to house 222 people on the vessel, but more than 500. Prior to its arrival in Portland, each of the barge's beds were swapped out for bunk beds. Some of its residents will share with just one other person, whilst others will be packed into rooms of 6. The result is cramped quarters with little personal storage space and beds which are just 6 foot long. In fact, one member of Parliament calculated that even once all communal areas are taken into account, Bibby Stockholm provides each resident with less room to live than the area of a single car parking space.
Such conditions aren't just uncomfortable, they're potentially lethal.
In August, the Fire Brigades Union, which represents British firefighters, threatened to take the government to court, arguing that the difficulty of evacuating more than 500 people from a vessel designed to hold less than half that was likely to put both residents and firefighters at unnecessary risk in the event of a fire. Overcrowded conditions such as these also vastly increase the ease with which illness can spread from person to person. And this is before we even begin to discuss the mental health impact of being forced to live cheek to cheek with absolute strangers with whom one might not even share a language.
As much as the Home Office might like to resist characterizations of Bibby Stockholm as a revival of the prison ships of the 19th century then, it's clear that life for residents will be pretty brutal. But what led us to this point? How did housing asylum seekers in such conditions not only come to be seen as logistically and politically feasible, but actively desirable? For the benefit of folks watching from outside the UK, I think it's worth emphasising that Bibby Stockholm is not some obscure government scheme. This is a flagship policy.
Barely a week has passed over the last 6 months in which Prime Minister Rishi Sunak or his Home Secretary Suella Braverman have not talked up either Bibby Stockholm itself or their plans to introduce further barges in the near future. And both Sunak and Braverman would like us to view this large boat as a response to a wave of smaller boats, which began arriving on England's south coast in 2018.
For those less familiar with the topic, the paradox of seeking asylum in a foreign country is that, although everyone has the right to do so under the Refugee Convention of 1951, actually applying for asylum usually involves first having to enter a country illegally in order to submit an application.
Prior to 2018, most asylum seekers trying to cross the border into the UK via mainland Europe did so by stowing away on lorries or trains which were travelling through the Channel Tunnel. Efforts to increase security at the tunnel's Calais depot, however, have since made doing so much harder. The result is that people looking to claim asylum in the UK have been choosing instead to make the treacherous journey across the top of the English Channel in small, inflatable dinghies. One effect of this has been to make the arrival of asylum seekers in the UK far more visible than it was before. Crossings via the Channel Tunnel were certainly widely reported on, but images of boats arriving at the shore are just so much more provocative in their visual legibility. Each summer, when fair weather means crossings have been more frequent, TV news broadcasts have become punctuated with voyeuristic footage of overloaded inflatables bobbing over the border.
At the same time, the UK's asylum application process has come under increasing scrutiny.
Over the past 5 years, the number of people waiting to hear back on an application for refugee status in the UK has grown from a relatively steady 31,000 people between 2014 and 2017 to more than 166,000 people. This creates a further problem for the government, because asylum seekers are banned from working, meaning that anyone without enough money to buy food and pay rent is forced to rely on help from the government whilst they wait to find out whether they'll be accepted as a refugee. Until recently, this involved the Home Office arranging shared, privately rented houses or flats. As the backlog of people waiting to hear back on their applications has grown, however, sourcing enough homes has become much more difficult. In response, the government has begun to simply hire out entire hotels, housing people en masse in single locations. Much like Bibby Stockholm, the conditions within these hotels, which are currently housing around 47,000 people, are appalling. Overcrowded, noisy, with little privacy, and the constant threat that infection might tear through the facility.
Having arrived in the country with nothing, many residents have been left without even basics such as shoes. And with an allowance of just £1.37 per day to cover all non-food expenses, life is not only austere, but mind-numbingly boring.
To Britain's highly influential right-wing press, however, this grim reality hasn't mattered much. See, a minority of these hotels happen, under normal circumstances, to be 4-star. Some happen to be in central London. Journalists at anti-migrant papers have thus leapt on these details to paint a picture of asylum seekers living the high life at the taxpayers' expense. The anger this has stoked in their readerships came to a head in February 2023, when right-wing protesters descended on a hotel in Merseyside, clashing with police, hurling missiles, and torching a police van. And it's this controversy over the use of hotels as accommodation for asylum seekers which brings us back to Bibby Stockholm.
As I mentioned before, Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman have sought to frame Bibby Stockholm as a direct response, both to the rise of small boat crossings across the English Channel and to the increased use of hotels as asylum seeker accommodation.
In fact, the arrival of the barge's first residents was carefully orchestrated to coincide with what the government called Small Boats Week, a week-long press event dedicated to highlighting the Conservative Party's efforts to reduce channel crossings. The week was actually a bit of a disaster for the government, with legal challenges to the Bibby Stockholm project meaning they were only able to board 15 of what they eventually hope will be 500 residents. Nevertheless, the intended narrative the government was trying to push throughout the week was clear. First, that quote, illegal migrants are breaking through British borders in increasing numbers. Second, that once here, they are being furnished with luxury accommodation at great expense. And third, that the use of Bibby Stockholm and other such barges is going to bring an end to this scenario. This is no doubt a compelling narrative to some. The idea that floods of scary migrants are coming to the UK to take advantage of the country is hardly new. It's been a constant feature of modern British politics, from Oswald Mosley to Enoch Powell to Nigel Farage. The problem is that as soon as we take a critical eye to any of these claims, the entire rationale for the use of Bibby Stockholm quickly falls apart.
Let's start by exploring this idea that increasing numbers of, quote, illegal migrants are storming Britain's borders like some kind of scene out of Saving Private Ryan.
Because over the past year, front-bench Conservative politicians have increasingly used this language of illegality to describe people arriving in the UK to seek asylum. Suella Braverman sparked particular controversy in 2022 when she said this in the House of Commons.
The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast and which party is not.
So what are the legal facts here? Well, presently it's a little bit complicated.
See, the UK is a signatory to both the 1951 Refugee Convention and the later 1967 Refugee Protocol. In theory, this gives anyone who believes themselves to be at risk of persecution in their own country the right to come to and apply for asylum in the UK. It doesn't mean the UK has to accept their application, but it does mean the government has to properly consider it. Now, there's always been a bit of a weird compromise in refugee law. As I mentioned earlier, in order to use one's internationally recognised legal right to seek asylum, one usually has to first enter a country illegally in order to submit an application. The Refugee Convention actually explicitly recognises that making a technically illegal border crossing whilst seeking protection will likely be necessary, and specifically bans countries from punishing asylum seekers for doing so.
Until very recently then, when Sunak, Braverman and other right-wing politicians referred to asylum seekers as illegal migrants, they were using the fact that they had technically broken the law by entering the country illegally in order to whip up fear and hatred against a perceived other. But in 2023, the government went further. As of last September, the newly passed Illegal Migration Act has amended the asylum application process so that anyone who is found to have entered the country illegally will have any application for asylum they submit rejected out of hand.
In short, this represents a complete and total ban on people seeking asylum in the UK outside of official programmes such as that organised for Ukrainians in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How this law will be implemented remains to be seen. But even if people who previously would have been deemed genuine asylum seekers are now officially, quote, illegal migrants, it is only as a result of the UK government consciously breaking with its commitments under international law.
Even under the old system, which remains in place as of now, not everyone who submits an application for asylum will be awarded full refugee status.
During 2022, for example, there was a brief spike in the number of asylum seekers coming to the UK from Albania. Given that Albania is generally seen to be a safe country, many had their applications for refugee status rejected. Whilst women were more likely to be granted protection as victims of human trafficking, just 11% of applications from Albanian men resulted in them being given permission to stay in the UK. Nevertheless, the overall number of false claims remains pretty tiny. 86% of people who have arrived via small boat since 2018 and who have received a decision on their application were granted some form of protection. And remember, this isn't some cuddly pushover process. Successfully receiving refugee status in the UK involves pleading your case to the same government department that is currently coordinating a fleet of prison ships, and even them going, yeah, I guess you've got a point.
But even if many of these asylum seekers are genuinely desperate and needy, what of the number of them? Well, the number of people coming to the UK to seek asylum is, on the whole, pretty tiny.
According to the UN, 72% of the world's refugees are presently hosted in a country neighbouring the one they fled. Of those who choose to venture further, the UK isn't actually a particularly popular choice. Britain is, of course, a pretty small country, but even if we scale the asylum application statistics so they are proportionate to the number of people in a country's existing population, we find that the UK receives just 8.4 asylum applications per 10,000 citizens in comparison to 15.3 in Spain, 17.9 in France, and 23 in Germany. To put this a slightly different way, if we count up everyone who lives in the UK who is either a refugee, asylum seeker, or who was previously a refugee who has now gained citizenship, we find they make up just 0.6% of the UK population. The number of applications for asylum in the UK has certainly risen in recent years. But those scenes of asylum seekers being packed into overcrowded hotels? The government would like Brits to view those as evidence of some kind of exponential surge in the number of people arriving on British shores asking for help. But that's simply not the case.
As a reminder, the people presently being housed in hotels, some of whom are due to be transferred onto Bibby Stockholm, are there because they're awaiting a decision on an application for asylum. If they receive notice they've been successful, they'll be granted full refugee status, which gives them the right to work and thus the ability to earn their own money. If they're unsuccessful, they'll be given notice to leave the country entirely. But until they receive that decision, they remain trapped in a kind of limbo.
By way of quantifying all of this, let me show you this graph, which plots the number of new asylum applications lodged in the UK between 2010 and 2022. This is new people arriving in the UK and submitting new applications into the system. And you will see, on the end there, a very real uplift in applications submitted. But now let me add a line plotting the number of people waiting to hear back on applications that are already in the system. As you can see, it makes the relative rise in new applications look tiny. The reason that so many people are currently being housed in hotels is thus far less the result of an increase in the number of new people trying to claim asylum, as it is an increase in the amount of time it is taking the Home Office to process their claims. The truth is that successive Conservative governments have overseen more than a decade of real terms pay cuts to civil service staff. This has led to a crisis of low morale, high staff turnover, and falling productivity. The consequences for the asylum process, and those trapped within it, have been dire. In 2014, 87% of asylum seekers received a decision on their application within 6 months. By 2021, that figure was just 6%. The real problem then is less more people going into the system than it is government cuts, meaning that fewer people are getting out of it the other end.
Okay, but even if the need to use hotels is primarily the result of government cuts, surely the use of vessels such as Bibby Stockholm can still help to ease some of the pressure off the asylum accommodation system. Well,
even as dangerously overcrowded as the government is determined for it to be, a population of 500 is nothing to the 47,000 people currently living in hotels. Whilst there are plans for 2 more vessels in progress, the UK would need dozens of these barges to make any real impact. It's not even that there is any real cost benefit to housing people on the water rather than on land. One recent report suggested that hiring and running Bibby Stockholm would likely cost around £18.5 million per year. According to calculations by Private Eye, that's more than the cost of sending every single resident on a year-long Disney cruise. Whilst the Conservatives' love of privatisation and outsourcing means that housing asylum seekers in hotels was already costing a small fortune, there's a good chance that barges like Bibby Stockholm will end up costing even more.
so if Bibby Stockholm and other proposed vessels are unlikely to either ease the pressure on the asylum accommodation system or save the government money, what's really going on here? Is it just incompetence? Or is it something a little more sinister? On first glance, Rishi Sunak attempting to draw so much attention to the crisis in the asylum system might seem like a kind of weird political play. As we've seen, this is a crisis entirely of the government's own making. And most political comms experts would probably suggest it's usually better to draw voters' attention to, something you're actually doing well at.
Unfortunately, there just isn't all that much that is going well for the government at the moment. As Hannah Rose Woods wrote in The New Statesman at the end of 2022, Britain has become a country in which, quote, everything is unaffordable and nothing seems to work as it should do. Energy bills are through the roof. So too are hospital waiting times. So too is the cost of housing. Sometimes there's no veg in the supermarket. Sometimes there's no eggs. Very soon we might run out of water. And successive real-term pay cuts for doctors, train drivers, teachers, nurses, civil servants and others mean that on any given day, at least one group providing a mission-critical public service is likely to be on strike. The Conservative Party has also been in power for a consecutive 13 years, which makes it pretty hard for the party to pass the buck on any of these issues. The Tories now regularly dip to being 20 points behind in the polls, and with the general election due to take place in 2024, they look set to be pretty unceremoniously turfed out in favour of Keir Starmer's Labour Party.
The crisis in the asylum system might be of the government's own creation then, but fear-mongering about immigration and promising to lower it has long been a topic which the British right has been able to leverage for electoral success.
Just take a look at this poster from the 2016 EU referendum, which misappropriated a photo of refugees taken in Slovenia in order to imply that asylum seekers were heading to Britain in droves. Immigration works as a wedge issue for the political right, not only because it's one Brits have been primed to care about, but because it's one which, at least until very recently, they've tended to assume the Conservatives will be more proactive on than Labour. When, in March 2023, Rishi Sunak first appeared behind a somewhat dystopian podium reading "Stop the Boats," then he was essentially playing the greatest hits, echoing several other successful three-word slogans of recent years. Take back control, get Brexit done, and, of course, across the Atlantic, build the wall. Whether or not Bibby Stockholm is likely to be effective isn't really the point here. The government has plenty of options at its fingertips for actually reducing the asylum backlog. It could hire more staff to process applications quicker. It could open up routes for people to apply for asylum in the UK without having to travel to the country first. It could grant asylum seekers work permits so they can earn their own money and be less reliant on government support. None of these, however, would be likely to attract the kind of widespread coverage that commissioning a fleet of prison ships has. If they did gain traction, they would likely be criticised by the right-wing press for being too compassionate.
The barbarity and downright weirdness of Bibby Stockholm is therefore very much the point. This project is pure spectacle, designed to distract from the party's many failures in other spheres and draw the media's attention to a topic where Sunak and Braverman feel that they have the upper hand. Even if this tactic isn't enough to actually turn the tide and give the Conservatives a chance of winning the next election, the hope is that this orchestrated performance of cruelty will be enough to hold together a rump of supporters in the party's most radical right-wing base to ensure they're not consigned to oblivion once and for all.
Where things get really worrying is that even if the Conservatives do suffer the devastating defeat which is predicted for them at the next election, there might be little reprieve for the victims of Bibby Stockholm. See, in August 2023, the Labour Party's shadow immigration minister, Stephen Kinnock, was interviewed on Sky News. In that interview, he was asked whether a future Labour government would continue to use Bibby Stockholm on taking office. This was his response.
We will have to deal with the infrastructure that we have and the complete chaotic, shambolic mess that the Conservative government will have left us.
A week later, another top Labour politician confirmed the party's plan to keep Bibby Stockholm in operation. Both, for what it's worth, expressed some regret at the use of such vessels, but neither would commit to immediately freeing people from this evidently punishing, dangerous facility. Some more liberal, centrist elements in the media applauded Canuck's response. The New Statesman's Rachel Wearmouth suggested that declining to commit to closing Bibby Stockholm amounted to Labour, quote, refusing to play Rishi Sunak's game by not appearing soft on immigration.
The problem is that whilst Bibby Stockholm might be intended as pure media spectacle, the harm it will cause is very, very real. The UK is currently in a position where both the government and the official opposition are willing to view the suffering caused by such a facility as a necessary trade-off for winning a few more votes come election time. And that is a very chilling place to be indeed.
So, making videos like this is always a morbidly fascinating process, because the virulent anti-refugee sentiment which has encouraged the hiring of Bibby Stockholm has been whipped up primarily by right-wing newspapers, which I don't make a habit of frequenting. In fact, just last month, the UK government published statistics claiming that the number of people crossing the English Channel by small boat had exceeded 100,000 over the past 5 years. And as you can see from this graph generated by Ground News, right-wing news outlets leapt on this figure to generate further outrage against asylum seekers. Right-wing papers were not only more likely to cover the story, but to do so in a much more alarmist tone. Where the Independent's headline was relatively dry and factual, for example, The Sun's was highly editorialised, declaring that Britain simply cannot afford to swallow 100,000, quote, illegal migrants. This discrepancy in reporting can present a big challenge to folks on the left, because the absence of these stories in our news feeds and For You pages can sometimes make it hard to understand why folks who do get their news primarily from right-wing outlets are so angry about certain issues. In an age of hyper-partisan reporting, it's sometimes the case that they're literally not seeing the same news stories we are. Today's sponsor, Ground News, is a tool that I use to get a firm overview of what stories are dominating different portions of the media at any given time. It collates together reporting from over 50,000 different news sources, and this allows you to compare how different outlets report on the same story, which aspect of an event they emphasise, and which aspect they conveniently leave out. For each version of that story about 100,000 asylum seekers having crossed the English Channel, for example, Ground News shows me the political leanings of the outlet which published that story, an independent rating of how factual that outlet's reporting tends to be, as well as who owns that outlet. In addition to this, Ground News has an excellent feature called the blind spot feed, which is probably my favourite. This highlights stories which appear to be receiving a disproportionate amount of coverage from either right-leaning or left-leaning sources, allowing you to address your media blind spot. I find this ability to find out what stories right-wing outlets are bombarding their readership with incredibly useful in trying to better understand why readers of those sites might be so incensed about certain issues. Ground News is a great tool for sifting through misinformation and bias. In an increasingly confusing modern media environment, it allows you to get the perspective that you need to think critically about the media. And because this is a YouTube sponsorship, Ground News have given me a discount which will get you 30% off their Vantage subscription tier, which you can grab by heading to ground.news/Tom Nicholas. If you want to support the channel whilst also supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent, then you can find out more about Ground News at ground.news/Tom Nicholas. Now, time for some thank yous. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it's given you some insight into what I think is a pretty important issue, whether you're based in the UK or elsewhere in the world. If you have got something out of it, then I'd love it if you'd share it with a friend who you also think might find it interesting. All that remains is for me to thank my top tier supporters over on Patreon. Richard, Alan Gann, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, Al Zweigart, ZC Reese, Alexander Blank, Neil Zabildgaard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Nicholas Jacquemart, Strange Weekend, Ricardo Fernandez de Cordoba, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Demelza, Jimmy Dunn, Christopher Cowan, Fiasco Linguini, and Agent Maxwell. If you'd like to join them in supporting what I do here, whilst getting early access to sneak peeks at videos, copies of scripts, and more, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again, and have a great week.